You said at the beginning, is there any limit to free speech? And I'm rather disturbed we're still discussing this. We in the West still have this pathetic discussion about, oh, what are the limits of free speech? Really?
I find it rather strange that Douglas Murray, who's had a history of advocating for restrictions on Muslim speakers at universities, he deigns to say he's a champion for free speech, so to speak, but yet his organization argued for restrictions on, for platforms for Muslim speakers going to universities. He wanted to ban the burqa in public buildings and a kind of social ban on it in public. So for him, and argued that conditions for Muslims in Europe must be made harder across the board.
Let's bring Douglas back in. Douglas, wait.
I find it a little. I find it a little bit strange that he should deign to call himself, brazenly call himself, or at least imply he's some kind of champion for free speech.
First tonight, does free speech ever go too far? Legendary British author Salman Rushdie was stabbed on stage in New York State last week. He's now off a ventilator but remains in a critical condition. The 75-year-old has faced years of death threats over his novel The Satanic Verses, which some Muslims see as blasphemous. Comedian Dave Chappelle was attacked on stage in May, and Netflix has faced repeated calls to drop him over his jokes on gender and trans issues. Rarely, though, are attacks on free speech so literal and so dangerous. But performers face the ever-present threat of cancel culture. On the same day that Rushdie was attacked, comedian Jerry Sadowitz had his Edinburgh show axed over complaints of racism and misogyny. And, of course, Britain's own Jimmy Carr faced a massive backlash for a joke about gypsies and the Holocaust. A joke, he said, could have ended his career. So for us tonight, there's one big question. Is there such a thing as too much free speech? Or should we always defend the right to offend? Now, joining me from New York, I'm joined by Conservative author Douglas Murray. To quote Piers Morgan, Douglas, has the world gone nuts, my friend?
I would ask a different question, if I may. You said at the beginning, is there any limit to free speech? And I'm rather disturbed we're still discussing this. It's 3 decades and more since the Satanic Verses affair. It was in 1989 that the Ayatollah Khomeini did the unpardonable, unforgivable thing of calling for the murder of a British novelist for the crime of writing a novel. And we had these debates back then. Where are the limits to free speech? Has Mr. Rushdie committed a crime as well as the Ayatollah? And a lot more guff like that. I'm rather disturbed that in all of the decades since, with all of the people who've been killed for asserting their right to free speech, or asserting their right to say what they think and for the rest of us to hear it, but we're still at this elementary playground level of discussion. I'm sorry to say that, but this is a long, long answered question. Our societies have perfectly good incitement laws in place. The rest of it, I'm sorry, no, we're not adapting our own speech codes. We're not going to make ourselves more sensitive to people who famously burn books that they can't even read. I mean, the Ayatollah Khomeini had never even read the Satanic Verses when he asked for Muslims around the world to kill Salman Rushdie. It's an unpardonable thing that has happened. It is extraordinary to me that we're still having this discussion. We had the same discussion 7 years ago when the cartoonists of Charlie Hebdo were being murdered. We had the same discussion in all of these decades, and it's Muslims and non-Muslims who've been attacked. And we in the West still have this pathetic discussion about, oh, what are the limits of free speech? Really, we've got to get better than that.
Douglas, I agree with you, but it's not just Islam, is it? We'll talk to Abdul Al-Andalusi in a minute. But it's also comedy. We talked about Dave Chappelle, we talked about Jimmy Carr. There doesn't seem to be a week that goes by without some comedian making a joke that a certain group, a certain number of people find distasteful. I obviously
that might be true.
I obviously come from a different planet, because here's what I would say. We have an on-off button. If you want to go and see a comedian, you buy a ticket. If you want to watch a television programme, you pick that channel. If you want to read Salman Rushdie's book, you surely have a right. Are we not getting to the point where free speech is under attack in our world, in our nation?
It's been under attack for a long time. I don't particularly care for a lot of the sort of belly aching and complaining on rather frivolous online stuff that I hear from a lot of authors and others. I think that people have to toughen up a bit on some of that. But the Rushdie affair has always been in a different class, and there's a reason for that. And there's a reason why so many people today are willing to make death threats against authors and others for all sorts of things, including comedians. And it's because they saw that it works. Yeah. It works. When the Ayatollah called for the murder of Salman Rushdie, people on the left and right of British politics and of British culture made excuses for the fatwa. I'm sure we'll hear some excuses today. They learned, our societies learned, that if somebody says, I'm offended, and then says, and as a result, I'm going to kill, you better be damn sure that you're willing to die for that. And unfortunately, the success of the Ayatollah's fatwa, among other things, is that it showed a load of other disgruntled people what they could do if they only had the disgustingness to think that they could exercise violence as an opposition to the pen. And I'm afraid that what happened, as I say, is that Muslim extremists across the UK and across the world showed they could intimidate people, and others undoubtedly have learned from this. But let's remember, Britain in 1989, we allowed Muslims in Bradford to burn the Quran, the satanic verses on the streets of Britain. We allowed prominent figures like Cat Stevens to excuse the murder of Salman Rushdie on the television. We allowed Iranian officials who had called for Rushdie's murder to live in London. Like, how stupid are we?
Interesting, Douglas. Thank you for Now New York. Let's pick up now with journalist Martha Gill, Emma Wedd from the Free Speech Union, and co-founder of the Muslim Debate Initiative, Abdullah Al-Andalusi. Let's start with you, if we can, Abdullah. Quite a strong rhetoric from Douglas Murray. I'm always aware that Muslim extremists do not in any way speak for the majority of Muslims. But to be fair, the Iranian government over the weekend said Rushdie was to blame for being attacked. That is completely and utterly despicable, isn't it?
Well, firstly, I find it rather strange that Douglas Murray, who's had a history of advocating for restrictions on Muslim speakers at universities...
But you can answer my question. Do you think it's despicable that the Iranian government have said that he took it on himself? He was stabbed in broad daylight. Do you find that despicable?
But if I may, he deigns to say he's a champion for free speech, so to speak, but yet his organisation argued for restrictions on, for platforms for Muslim speakers going to universities. He wanted to ban the burqa in public buildings and a kind of social ban on it in public. So for him, and argued that conditions for Muslims in Europe must be made harder across the board.
Let's bring Douglas back in. Douglas, wait.
I find it a little. I find it a little bit strange that he should deign to call himself, brazenly call himself, or at least imply he's some kind of champion for free speech. Free expression.
Look, I've probably got to answer that. You'll have noticed, and all of your viewers will have noticed, that this Islamist lunatic in your studio can't answer the basic question. Let's try it again and make it simple for you. Why don't you say whether or not you are completely condemning of any violence against Salman Rushdie or anyone else who is deemed to have said something heretical? Why don't we start with the basics for you?
Okay, firstly, I want to answer his question, because he asked me first, which is about the Iranian regime. Well, having not being an Iranian citizen, nor participated in any elections to elect the Iranian regime, the Iranian regime doesn't really represent 1.8 billion Muslims. And
OK, so if you're here representing 1.8 billion Muslims, it's very simple. Douglas has just said it. All right, as your own self, having heard what he said, do you accept people saying, be it the Iranian government or Muslim extremists, and I made the caveat and I repeat it, Muslim extremists, that one of the biggest problems I have is that people look at the whole thing and they shouldn't. Do you agree with anybody who comes up with the sentence, he was to blame for being knifed in broad daylight 15 times in his neck? Do you?
The only person to blame for the knifing of Salman Rushdie is the assailant himself.
Not the Iranian regime who put the fatwa on him in the first place.
Well, unless you can demonstrate that they were specifically colluding or they sent an agent.
They said he was to blame.
He was in communication with the Iranian Revolutionary Guard.
That's their opinion, right? But I'm only here to talk about, if you're asking me who's to blame, I say the assailant, much like Douglas Murray said that the Christchurch killer, the one who massacred the Muslims in the mosque, that only the killer was to blame, not those who radicalised him into viewing Muslims as a threat to the West.
What you'll find is that if somebody put millions of dollars on someone's head, yours, for instance, or mine, and somebody then attacked us, you would think that the person who had put millions of dollars on our head would bear some responsibility. But because you're such a dishonest weasel, you're not even willing to do that. You're not even willing to do the basic thing of condemning the attack.
Sticks and stones, Douglas Murray, sticks and stones.
Why don't we
You need to demonstrate that the person was motivated by the reward.
I'll tell you what I'd like to motivate.
I'll
tell you what I'd like to demonstrate. This is my programme. Martha Gill, journalist. What's your opinion on this situation?
Well, it's completely horrific. I completely agree with the other two, with Douglas Murray, in that if putting a bounty on someone's head in the first place is an act of violence, whether or not that's followed up by people taking on the challenge, and clearly somebody has, and they are entirely to blame for that.
Let's move on to... I wanted to ask you generally, you've been quite open about free speech. When does free speech cross a line, Martha?
So every functioning society has to have some limits on free speech. If you agree with any law on hate speech, then you agree on limits to free speech in society. You know, if you say, actually, it's fine to say anything, you quickly run up against a paradox, which is that you say it's fine to somebody to go on TV and call for the death of somebody else for expressing a view. So their freedom of speech is immediately restricting the freedom of speech of others. So you do need some limits on free speech in a free society. Now, of course, we can argue where you draw the line.
I was going to say, Emma, would you say we've gone too far?
In restricting free speech?
Yeah.
I think absolutely we have. I agree with Douglas that I think that short of incitement, those things that are illegal under the law, incitement being things like, for example, putting a fatwa out on somebody, that would count as incitement in my book because it's actively calling for violence against someone. And in this case, for something that someone has written.
Does incitement compel people to actually be violent, though?
Well, hold on a second. Does it incite them? It encourages them. If you are through a group or a clan or whatever you want to say, and I'm treading carefully for obvious reasons, if you feel that you're following a group, whatever it is, and they're telling you to do something, you're sitting there saying that bloke wasn't. I mean,
isn't that my free will, though? Isn't the whole basis of the Western system based on people's free will?
Do you believe that man would have gone and stabbed Salman Rushdie unless he had been encouraged, incentivised, galvanised, whatever words you want, from people, the Iranian government, who say Salman Rushdie is to blame on putting a fatwa on his head? That's wrong,
I'm
isn't it?
simply saying that, unlike knee-jerk dog whistle politics we hear from Douglas Murray, why don't we wait to the court case to see what motivated the individual? I'm waiting for the evidence. I'm waiting to, what does he say motivated him? If he said it was motivated by the Iranian government fatwa, fine, I accept.
Do you not think he might have been? I guess is the question.
Yeah, he might have been,
right.
Yes.
I'd like to finish my point.
Yeah, go.
So we have in this country a teacher who is still in hiding, the teacher from Batley Grammar School, because he showed a cartoon of the Prophet Muhammad to his class. He's still in hiding with his young family. That is in this country now. I think that what we have done as a result of everything that happened with Salman Rushdie in the intervening 33 years, I think that we have internalised this attitude of censorship, so that now if somebody wanted to write a book like Salman Rushdie's book, no publisher would touch them because they would know what the implications would be for that person, because we've internalised Sharia law on this. We've internalised, in many ways, we've internalised the censorship of radical ideological groups.
I don't think you can compare an illiberal regime such as the one in Iran to the one here.
That's not what I was doing. But...
No, of course, but you can't really compare the types of restriction on free speech. We have some restrictions laid down in law. They have a huge number of restrictions enforced by their government and ruling groups. The way that free speech gets restricted here is more by a process of consensus and debate, like the debate we're having here, on where lines should be drawn. It's often done with individuals. You can pretty much say anything you like if you find the right audience for it.
I would love to sit here all night. I literally am being shouted at in my ear. We could continue this. To all of you, Abdullah, thank you so much indeed. Douglas Murray from New York, Martha Gill, and obviously Emma Webb. Everybody has an opinion. Somebody said to me today, the attacker of Salman Rushdie, like millions of others worldwide, almost certainly had absolutely no knowledge of the Satanic Verses, a book that came out 33 years ago. So one would have to wonder, is he just an evil person or is he motivated? What are your thoughts? It's important. At the end of the day, everybody will have their own opinion. Don't go anywhere. Next on Uncensored,